The last log on the fire popped, spitting a shower of defiant sparks into the gloom. It was a futile gesture. The ember's glow was dying, and with it, the last vestige of warmth in the one-room cabin. Outside, the Wyoming winter of 1888 howled, a relentless, shrieking predator clawing at the log walls, its icy breath seeping through every chink and crack. Eliza Jane McCarthy drew the threadbare quilt tighter around the four small bodies huddled beside her. Her children. They were the only reason she hadn't surrendered to the despair that gnawed at her, a hunger far deeper than the one in her belly. Caleb, at 12, was a statue of grim responsibility, his jaw set as he stared into the dying flames. Mary, her 10-year-old face pale and thin, clutched the hand of her younger brother Samuel, who shivered silently, his 7-year-old spirit seemingly frozen solid. But it was the sound from the smallest bundle that tore Eliza's soul to shreds. A cough. A dry rattling sound from 4-year-old Rose, so weak it was barely a whisper. Each one felt like a grain of sand slipping through the hourglass of her daughter's life. They were trapped, not just by the mountains of snow that had buried their small homestead, but by the suffocating grip of one man's greed. The cold was his weapon, starvation his accomplice, and this isolated valley, their intended grave. A year. It had been a full year since she'd buried Liam. A good man, her Liam. A man with hands calloused from work and a heart full of dreams for this very land. A fall from a spooked horse, the official report had said. But Eliza had seen the truth in the cold, reptilian eyes of Silas Blackwood at the funeral. He hadn't even bothered to feign sympathy. It was a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. Liam's homestead, their dream, possessed the only year-round spring in the entire valley, a jewel of life-giving water that Blackwood, the cattle baron who considered the entire territory his personal fiefdom, coveted with a venomous obsession. The war of attrition had begun almost immediately. It was a campaign of calculated cruelty, designed to break her spirit and drive her off the land Liam had legally bought and paid for. The first blow had been against their water. Caleb had made the discovery one brittle morning, his face a mask of horror and disgust. "Ma, come quick!" he'd yelled, his voice cracking. She'd followed him to the well, the cold air stinging her lungs. The stench hit her first, a gagging odor of decay. Peering over the stone lip, she saw it. A bloated coyote, its fur matted and its dead eyes staring up from the depths of their water source. The act was so vile, so deliberately malevolent, it had stolen her breath. From then on, survival meant the back-breaking labor of hauling buckets of snow into the cabin, melting them over the precious fire, cup by precious cup. It was a constant, exhausting reminder of their vulnerability. Next came the livestock. Their 6 fat hens, whose eggs were a small but vital source of protein, vanished one night without a sound. Then Bess, their gentle milk cow, was gone. Caleb, with a grim determination that belied his age, had tried to track them. The trail was painfully obvious, a single set of cow tracks flanked by the hoofprints of 2 horses, leading directly north towards the sprawling, ominous shadow of Blackwood's ranch. There was no need for a posse or a judge. The evidence was etched in the snow. The final act of their imprisonment came disguised as an act of nature. Blackwood's men, under the pretense of moving a herd, had driven hundreds of cattle back and forth across the mouth of the valley, packing the snow into an impassable wall. A blockade that severed their last link to the town of Redemption and to life itself. Sheriff Brody's visit a week later had been the cruelest blow of all. He wasn't there to uphold the law. He was there as Blackwood's errand boy. He sat heavily on their sturdiest stool, which groaned under his weight, his large frame seeming to suck the very air from the room. He sweated despite the cold, dabbing at his florid face with a grubby handkerchief. "Eliza," he'd begun, his voice oozing a false sympathy that made her skin crawl. "You're a sensible woman. You can't hold out here. It's not safe." "My husband's deed is filed and legal, Sheriff," Eliza had said, her voice tight and low. "This is my land." "Deeds are just paper," Brody had mumbled, refusing to meet her eyes. "Silas Blackwood is a reality. He's made you a fair offer. For the children's sake, you should take it. A winter like this, accidents happen." The threat, veiled though it was, hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. He was a weak man, a man whose integrity had been bought and paid for, and in that moment, Eliza hated him almost as much as she hated Blackwood. His departure had sealed their fate. They were alone. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of cold, hunger, and fear. Eliza rationed the last of their salted pork and dried beans with a miser's hand, her own stomach a constant, aching void. From his vantage point, high in the snow-dusted pines, Nakota watched the small cabin. He had been tracking a buck for 2 days when he'd first noticed the unnatural stillness of the place. The smoke from the chimney was a pale, anemic wisp, a sign of a dwindling fire. He had seen the blockade at the valley's entrance, recognized it not as a natural drift, but as the deliberate work of men. White men. His hand instinctively went to the worn leather pouch at his belt. Inside was a single eagle feather, the only tangible memory he had of his son. The memory, sharp and painful as a fresh wound, returned unbidden. Another winter. Another act of senseless violence. A raid on his small camp by gold prospectors who saw his people not as human beings but as obstacles. His wife, his daughter, his son, gone. Extinguished like embers in a storm. He had become Nakota, he who walks alone, a ghost in the mountains, his heart a frozen landscape mirroring the peaks around him. He wanted nothing to do with the white man's world, with its insatiable greed and casual cruelty. Yet he found himself drawn to the silent cabin. He had seen the children playing in the yard weeks ago before the heavy snows had come, and their laughter had stirred something deep within him, a phantom limb of a life he had lost. He saw Blackwood's men scouting the property, their presence a dark stain on the pristine snow, and he knew what they were. Vultures circling a dying animal. He remained a silent, unseen observer, torn between his vow of solitude and the insistent pull of a shared humanity. Desperation was a wildfire in Caleb's young heart. He couldn't watch his family waste away. Rose's labored breathing was a constant, terrifying rhythm in the quiet cabin. He had to do something. Anything. "I'm going to town, Ma," he announced, his voice a low, determined croak. Eliza's head snapped up. "No, Caleb, you can't. Blackwood's men—" "Will die if I don't," he interrupted, his eyes pleading. "I'll be careful. I can sneak past them in the dark." He pulled on Liam's oversized coat, the worn wool smelling of his father, of wood smoke and faint hope. Before Eliza could protest further, he slipped out the door and was swallowed by the twilight gloom. The snow was deep, each step a lung-burning effort. The cold was a physical thing, a solid weight pressing down on him. He moved through the skeletal trees, a small, determined shadow in a world of white. He could see it now, the blockade, and beyond it, the faint, trampled path. A flicker of firelight revealed a small group of men huddled against the cold. He recognized the hulking form of the man they called Scar, a brutal enforcer whose face was a roadmap of violent encounters. "Well, looky what the cat dragged in." Scar's voice, rough as gravel, cut through the night. He'd been spotted. Panic seized Caleb, but he held his ground. "Let me pass," he said, his voice trembling but defiant. "My sister is sick. We need medicine." Scar let out a harsh, barking laugh that was devoid of humor. "Sick, is she? A shame. Maybe your ma should have thought of that before she decided to play homesteader on Mr. Blackwood's land." One of the other men, reeking of cheap whiskey, grabbed Caleb by the collar of his coat, lifting him effortlessly. "This the whelp that thinks he's a man?" "We're starving," Caleb choked out, squirming in the man's grasp. "Starving is what happens when you're stubborn," Scar said, stepping closer, his foul breath washing over Caleb's face. "Here's a message for your ma. Mr. Blackwood's patience has run out. Sign the deed or the next visitor to your cabin will be the undertaker." They threw him to the ground. The impact knocked the wind from him. A boot connected with his ribs, a sharp, blinding explosion of pain. Another kick. He curled into a ball, trying to protect himself, the taste of blood filling his mouth. They laughed, the sound sharp and cruel in the frigid air. "Leave him," Scar commanded. "Let the cold teach him a lesson." They swaggered back to their fire, leaving Caleb a crumpled heap in the snow. The pain was immense, but the cold was worse. It was a creeping numbness, a heavy blanket that promised a final, dreamless sleep. His last conscious thought was of Rose's face, pale and small in the firelight. From the dark shelter of the pines, Nakoda witnessed it all. He had followed the boy, his tracker's instincts screaming of danger. The casual brutality, the gleeful cruelty. It was the same venom that had poisoned his own life. The ice around his heart, so long frozen solid, began to crack. He waited, his body a coiled spring of vengeful energy, until Scar and his men were distracted by their bottle. Then he moved. Silent as a shadow, he flowed through the trees, his moccasins making no sound on the snow. He reached Caleb, who was now barely conscious, his shivering growing weaker. With a gentleness that belied his own inner turmoil, Nakoda lifted the boy into his arms. He was lighter than he should be, too light. The ghosts of his own children whispered to him on the wind, their voices mingling with the boy's shallow breaths. He turned his back on the blockade and started the long walk back to the cabin. The vow of solitude was broken. He could not walk alone while this injustice stood. The soft, hesitant knock on the cabin door was so unexpected it sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. "They've come back." Grabbing the heavy iron poker from the hearth, its cold weight a small comfort, she crept to the door and pulled it open just a crack. The figure of the Cheyenne warrior filled the opening, a dark silhouette against the swirling snow, and in his arms, cradled like a broken doll, was Caleb. A strangled cry escaped Eliza's lips. All fear of the stranger vanished, consumed by a tidal wave of maternal terror. "Caleb!" She threw the door open, helping the warrior carry her son inside and lay him on the cot. The other children scrambled back, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. Rose let out a weak whimper. "He is hurt," Nakoda said, his voice a low rumble. "But he will live." Eliza fell to her knees beside her son, her hands hovering over his bruised and swollen face. Tears streamed down her cheeks, hot against her cold skin. She looked up at the stoic warrior, a jumble of emotions warring within her. Terror, confusion, and a burgeoning, desperate gratitude. Nakoda wasted no time. He moved with a quiet efficiency that was both calming and intimidating. He gently examined Caleb's injuries, his touch surprisingly deft. He then left the cabin, returning moments later with a handful of willow bark stripped from a tree near the frozen creek. He crushed it between two stones and, using a strip of clean cloth Eliza provided, fashioned a poultice, miming that it would help with the pain and swelling. He showed her how to brew a tea from the remaining bark, a natural fever reducer. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of hope ignited in Eliza's heart. This stranger, this man from a world she did not understand, had shown them more compassion in a few minutes than any of her own kind had in months. The days that followed settled into a new, strange rhythm. Nakoda became their silent protector. He never entered the cabin without a silent invitation, often just a nod from Eliza. He would disappear into the white wilderness for hours, always returning with something: a pair of rabbits, a string of fish caught from a secret spot in the ice-covered creek, and one glorious day, a small deer slung over his powerful shoulders. The smell of roasting meat, a scent they had only dreamed of, filled the small cabin, a heady perfume of survival. The initial fear the children felt slowly melted away. Mary, ever curious, became the unofficial ambassador. She would watch, fascinated, as Nakoda skinned a rabbit with his sharp knife or mended a snowshoe with sinew. She would point at objects and say their English names, and he would respond with the Cheyenne word, his stern face softening almost imperceptibly at her attempts to mimic him. Samuel, who had been lost in a silent world of his own, began to emerge from his shell, his eyes following the warrior's every move. Nakoda began to teach Caleb, not with words, but with actions. He showed him how to read the subtle signs of the forest, how to build a deadfall trap that was both simple and effective, how to move silently through the deep snow. In these quiet lessons, a bond of mutual respect formed between the warrior and the boy. Caleb, who had been forced to become a man too soon, found in Nakoda a figure of strength and wisdom, a mentor to fill the gaping void left by his father. But their precarious peace was not to last. Word of their survival, in the presence of their Cheyenne protector, reached Silas Blackwood. He sat in his opulent ranch house, a fire roaring in a stone fireplace large enough to roast an ox, a glass of expensive brandy in his hand. The news, delivered by a shamefaced Scar, sent him into a volcanic rage. "An Indian?" Blackwood bellowed, slamming his glass down so hard it shattered. "You were beaten back by one savage and a half-starved woman?" Scar flinched. "He's not just any savage, Mr. Blackwood. He moves like a ghost. And the blizzard?" "Excuses!" Blackwood spat, his face purple with fury. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about power, about crushing the defiance of a stubborn woman who dared to stand against him. It was a personal affront. "I want them gone. I don't care how you do it. Burn the cabin to the ground if you have to. But I want that land and I want them out of my valley. Permanently." The attack came during the height of a raging blizzard, the wind and snow providing the perfect cover for Scar and his gang. Nakota sensed them before he heard them. It was a subtle shift in the rhythm of the storm, a wrongness in the air. He rose silently, grabbing Liam's old rifle. "They come," he said, his voice a low warning. The first gunshot shattered the night, the bullet ripping through the log wall and burying itself in the opposite side of the cabin. Eliza screamed, pulling the children down to the floor, her body shielding them. The cabin, their only shelter, had become a death trap. What followed was a terrifying symphony of violence. Muzzle flashes lit the swirling snow outside, followed by the percussive thud of bullets hitting wood. The air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. But they were not just victims this time. Nakota, using the small window as a firing port, returned fire with deadly, methodical precision. He was a hunter, and these men were his prey. Eliza, her fear transmuted into a white-hot protective rage, grabbed the iron poker, its weight now feeling like an extension of her own arm. She stood over her children, a cornered lioness ready to defend her cubs to the death. A bullet splintered the window frame, sending a shard of wood flying that grazed Samuel's arm. He cried out, more in shock than pain, but the sight of her son's blood galvanized Eliza. At that moment, she was capable of murder. The fight was brutal and close. Scar, in his arrogance, tried to kick the door in. As the wood splintered, Nakota was there, firing Liam's rifle at point-blank range. The man screamed and fell back into the snow. Another tried to climb through the broken window, only to be met by Nakota's hunting knife. The ferocity of the defense, led by a warrior who seemed to be everywhere at once, stunned the attackers. They had expected a terrified woman and children. They found a fortress defended by a ghost. Bleeding and unnerved, Scar and the few men still standing dragged their wounded and retreated back into the howling chaos of the storm. Silence descended, broken only by the whimpering of the children and the roar of the wind. The cabin was a wreck, the air acrid, but they were alive. Samuel's wound was minor, but the psychological scars were deep. In the aftermath of the battle, the final barriers between Eliza and Nakota crumbled. They had fought together, bled together. They were no longer a widow and a warrior. They were allies, bound by the shared crucible of survival. As dawn broke, casting a pale, gray light over the ravaged landscape, Nakota knew they could not stay. "He will send more," he said, gesturing towards the north. "We must leave. Now." He told her of a place, a hidden camp of his people, far to the south, nestled in the protective embrace of the mountains. From there, he explained, they could travel to a fort, to the soldier chiefs who might listen to her story. It was a long, perilous journey, a desperate gamble, but it was their only hope. Eliza looked at the faces of her children, at the bullet-riddled walls of her home, and nodded. There was no other choice. In redemption, Jedediah the shopkeeper's fear had finally been outweighed by his shame. He had heard the distant echoes of the firefight carried on the wind. The thought of the McCarthy children, of kind, hardworking Liam, was a weight on his soul. Under the cover of the pre-dawn darkness, he loaded a sack with biscuits, salted jerky, a small wheel of cheese, and precious medicine. Laudanum for pain and quinine for fever. He left it at an old, hollowed-out stump at the edge of the valley, a landmark he knew the reclusive Cheyenne sometimes used as a drop point. It was Sheriff Brody who found Jedediah's tracks. On a patrol born more from guilt than duty, he followed them to the stump and found the sack. The simple act of charity, of defiance against Blackwood's iron rule, struck a chord in Brody's hollow chest. He looked from the sack toward the McCarthy homestead and then back towards the town where his authority was a sham. He had a wife and children of his own. What kind of man had he become? Returning to his office, he took out a fresh ledger and a pen. With a trembling hand, he began to write, documenting every crime, every threat, every piece of intimidation he knew Blackwood to be responsible for. It was a small act, a secret one, but it was a start. Nakota fashioned a crude travois, 2 long poles harnessed with leather straps, to carry Rose and the still-recovering Samuel. Eliza bundled what few possessions they had left, a spare quilt, Liam's Bible, and the deed to their land. As the blizzard began to subside, they slipped away from the cabin, leaving behind the ghosts of their past and the dream that had turned into a nightmare. They plunged into the vast, unforgiving wilderness, a small, desperate family led by a solitary warrior, their tracks quickly erased by the falling snow. When Blackwood discovered the abandoned, bullet-scarred cabin, his fury knew no bounds. They had escaped. The sheer audacity of it, the defiance, was more than he could bear. It was a personal insult that demanded a personal response. "Saddle my horse," he roared to his men. "They can't have gone far. We will hunt them down. And when I find them, I will wipe the memory of the name McCarthy from this valley forever." He led the chase himself, his obsession a burning fire in his gut. The pursuit was relentless, a cat-and-mouse game played out across a landscape of brutal beauty. Nakota, with his intimate knowledge of the mountains, led them on a treacherous path, through dense forests and over wind-swept ridges, trying to shake their pursuers. He pushed the family to the limits of their endurance. Every muscle in Eliza's body screamed in protest, but she looked at the determined set of Nakota's jaw, at Caleb trudging faithfully beside him, at the 2 small bundles on the travois. And she found a strength she never knew she possessed. The chase culminated at a place the Cheyenne called the Weeping Giant, a massive waterfall, now frozen into a spectacular, terrifying curtain of ice. It was a cathedral of silence and cold, its once thundering roar now trapped within the ice. Nakota knew this place. It was a place of power, and a place of danger. It would be here that they made their final stand. He led them to a small alcove behind the wall of frozen spray, hidden from immediate view. "Stay here," he commanded Eliza, his voice low and urgent. "Do not move until I call." He turned to Caleb. "You remember what I showed you about the deadfall?" Caleb nodded, his eyes wide but steady. Nakota pointed to a massive, precariously balanced log on a ledge above the frozen river basin. "When I give the signal, you will save us." Nakota stepped out into the open, a lone figure against the immense backdrop of ice. He fired a single shot from Liam's rifle, the sound cracking through the stillness, a clear challenge. Blackwood and his men, seeing their prey finally cornered, charged forward with triumphant yells, their horses slipping on the icy ground. They funneled into the basin before the waterfall, their focus entirely on the warrior. Nakota retreated slowly, drawing them further onto the frozen river. He had spent a precious hour before their arrival using his hatchet to score the ice, creating deep, hidden weaknesses in the seemingly solid surface. As Blackwood drew near, his face a mask of hateful triumph, Nakota let out a sharp, piercing cry. The signal. High above, Caleb put all his weight against the great log. It shifted, teetered for a heart-stopping moment, and then plunged downwards, hitting the center of the frozen river with a cataclysmic crash. The ice, weakened by Nakota's scoring, shattered. Great fissures spread outwards like a spiderweb. With a deafening groan, the river collapsed. Men and horses screamed as they were plunged into the churning, lethally cold water beneath. The current was swift, pulling them under the remaining sheets of ice. Blackwood, whose horse had shied at the last second, was left on a large, unstable floe, his pistol now useless, his face a picture of disbelief and terror. He was alive, but he was trapped. It was then that a new sound reached them, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. A posse, led by Sheriff Brody, crested the ridge and charged into the basin. With him were Jedediah and a dozen other townsmen, their faces grim and determined. "Silas Blackwood!" Brody's voice boomed, no longer weak or wavering, but filled with the conviction of the law. "You are under arrest for the murders of Liam McCarthy and 3 federal marshals, for land fraud, and for the attempted murder of this family." The fight went out of Blackwood. He was defeated, surrounded by the ghosts of his crimes, and the faces of the men he had once terrorized. He surrendered without a word. The long winter was finally over. Blackwood and his men were taken to Fort Laramie, where Sheriff Brody's ledger and the testimony of Eliza and others sealed their fate. The town of Redemption, freed from its tyrant, began to breathe again. The community, shamed by its past cowardice, rallied around the McCarthy family. Men from town helped rebuild their cabin, stronger this time. Jedediah kept their larder stocked, refusing any payment. The day came for Nakota to leave. An awkward silence hung between him and Eliza. There were no words sufficient to express the depth of her gratitude. She began, but her voice failed her. He simply nodded, his dark eyes conveying a universe of understanding. Mary stepped forward and pressed a small, clumsily carved bird into his hand. He closed his powerful fingers around it gently, a rare, true smile touching his lips. He looked at each of them one last time, a silent farewell, then turned and walked away, melting back into the mountains that were his home. 1 year later, the valley was reborn. Spring had painted the landscape in vibrant greens and yellows. The McCarthy homestead was thriving. Caleb, now a tall, confident young man, worked alongside his mother. Mary and Samuel's laughter filled the air. Rose, her cheeks rosy and full, chased butterflies in a field of wildflowers. Eliza stood on her porch, a gentle breeze stirring her hair, and looked out at the vast, beautiful land that was truly hers. Her gaze drifted to the high peaks in the south. There, almost imperceptible against the blue sky, a thin, solitary wisp of smoke rose towards the heavens. A signal. A promise. Their guardian was still watching. They were not alone.